Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I am Raymond Hain, a member of the philosophy department here and the director of the Providence College Humanities Forum. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this afternoon's very special event. The Humanities Forum is honored today to host, in partnership with the Office of Institutional Diversity, the inaugural lecture of the new Reverend Robert A. Morris Speaker Series. I'd now like to invite to the podium Rafael Zapata, Associate Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer, to introduce the new Speaker Series. Thank you and welcome again.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being out here on a Friday afternoon. Raymond, thank you for your kind introduction. While no one person alone can make such an undertaking possible, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you and recognize your vision, leadership, and tireless efforts that have made the Humanities Forum possible. Our office is proud to be co-sponsoring this event in conjunction with this inaugural Father Morris Speaker Series. I can't say enough. I think we do owe Raymond and the people who helped make this happen a round of applause, please. I arrived at Providence College in January 2012 as the college's first Associate Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer. Since that time, I heard a great deal of the man that we're honoring today with this speaker series, the Reverend Robert A. Morris, a graduate of Providence College's class of 1946, a member of the Dominican Order for nearly 65 years, and who, after first returning to PC in 1957, served in just about every role at the college. He taught English, he taught theology, was involved in the Blackfriar Theater in New York City. He was college chaplain, study abroad advisor, vice president for institutional advancement, and executive vice president. He also briefly served as interim president. And it is thought that if he had a doctorate, he probably would have been president at PC at one time or another. As one alum spoke of him, quote, "Few people connected to Providence College had the institutional knowledge of the Reverend Robert A. Morris. More than anything, his ability to connect with all types of people made him a beloved priest and friend to many at PC, perhaps none more so than members of PC's men's basketball team and members of the Martin Luther King Jr. Scholars Program, which he helped co-found with Professor Pat McKay in 1968, who thankfully is here with us today for this lecture. Thank you, Dr. McKay, for being here. Fortunately for the members of this community who knew him, Father Morris lived a long life, having passed in March 2015, a month short of his 92nd birthday. In his honor, we celebrate the inaugural Reverend Robert A. Morris Speaker Series, which will feature eminent leaders in diplomacy, education, business, athletics, the arts and sciences, who promote excellence and active engagement of diverse perspectives and voices to address and better understand our society's most vexing problems. It is clearly needed today. Given his life's work and his scholarship, it is fitting that Dr. Clayborne Carson is the series' first speaker. I now invite Dr. Patrick Breen of the History Department to introduce our guest this afternoon.
Thanks, Raphael, and thanks to Raymond Hain. And I also want to add one more thanks to you for coming here. Professor Carson came all the way across the country, and he came to speak to you. So this is really a special day. Our honored speaker today is Clayborne Carson. Professor Carson was born in upstate New York, but grew up in New Mexico, near the laboratory where the first atomic bomb was designed. At 19 years old, he traveled to Washington, D.C. to take part in the March for Jobs and Freedom, the march where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. It is fitting that the man who has since become the foremost steward of King's legacy was there. But Carson's life is not Forrest Gump's. King did not descend from the stairs, catch his eyes, and tell him, "Never forget this day." In fact, shortly before the march, Carson had met Stokely Carmichael, a charismatic leader within the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. When Carson told Carmichael that he was planning on attending the march, Carmichael rebuked Carson. "Who cares about a middle-class picnic?" he asked. Carson went anyway. But his attention that day was on the young activists, people like Representative John Lewis, the youngest speaker at the march that day. When King spoke, Carson found himself moving to the back of the crowd, hoping to make a quick exit. I hope you guys won't do that. It's a mistake. It was a mistake for him, a mistake for you. Carson was attracted to the vision of the radical activist on the ground, and his first book, In Struggle, is a remarkable achievement that remains, 35 years after its initial publication, the best scholarly account of the 1960s most important grassroots organizers. With that book and a position at Stanford, he was well positioned to become an important historian of the civil rights movement. But then he received a call that changed his life. Coretta Scott King asked Carson to edit and publish the papers of Martin Luther King, Jr. Although in some ways he felt inclined to reject the offer, Carson ultimately decided to take the position, and for the last 31 years he has shepherded 7 volumes of King's writings and materials into print. He now serves as both the Ronnie Lott founding director of the Martin Luther King Jr. and the Centennial, he serves as the Ronnie Lott founding director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Project and Stanford's Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor of History. While Carson has soared to the top of the academic food chain, he has never been satisfied to simply fill libraries with books, no matter how important the books. He has always understood that history needs an audience, and anyone who limits themselves to scholarly books limits the size of their audience. As a result, he's become one of the handful of successful historians who has made the transition to being a public intellectual. He has lectured in 48 states, and I'm wondering what North Dakota and South Dakota have it in for him. I don't know. He's appeared in dozens of documentaries and advised many, many more, including Eyes on the Prize, for which he worked as a senior historical advisor. He's also written a screenplay and a play. His play, Passages of Martin Luther King, has been performed in, among other places, Palestine and China. He has won too many awards to mention, at least if I'm going to let him speak today. So with no further ado, I present to you Professor Clayborne Carson.
Gosh, I'm the shortest person who's gotten up here, so you two. I'm really pleased to be here, and this has been a very short but very pleasurable event for me because before I was able to meet Patrick's students, and they are very challenging and have inquisitive, and if they're representative of the students here at Providence, this is a very good place to get a liberal arts education. I also feel like this is a wonderful time to be speaking. I haven't had many occasions during the summer. Stanford's academic year starts next week, so this is actually my first lecture of this academic year, and I just have been so eager to say something about all the things that are going on in the world, and haven't really had a chance to do that. But I'm not going to get into the easy business of talking about this election. That'll all be over in 50 days, and we'll have to live with the results. So what I would rather do is talk about a lot of other things that are going on in my mind, and maybe start in a place that might be unexpected for you, because I'd like to say a few words about Steve Jobs. And I'll make the connection, believe it or not, between Steve Jobs and Martin Luther King, other than the fact that he had a very big ego and might have seen himself as another Martin Luther King. But what interests me about him, other than the fact that he lived probably about 15 minutes from me, we probably crossed paths. I never met the guy, but we probably went, I know we went to the same restaurants. We were in classes that are probably right next to where I was teaching, because he often came over and audited classes at Stanford. But what interested me was, as I learned more about his life, I realized that I missed an opportunity, because in my own life, I started out as a computer programmer. That was my first entry into academic life. I was at UCLA and I needed a job. I had went into exile in 1967 as a draft dodger. Rather than going to prison, I decided to just leave the country. Prison, Paris. You know? So I decided to leave, and then for a variety of reasons, including my wife finding out that she was diabetic and got very sick when we were living in a commune in Spain, to come back to the United States, and I needed a job. And in high school, I grew up in Los Alamos, as Patrick said, and like practically every other person I knew, wanted to be a scientist, and I was particularly interested in math, and I started majoring in that in college. And I worked for a place called Audience Studies, which did audience research, and I learned a lot about doing statistics on survey research. So I knew I could get a job at the Survey Research Center, and there was this field that was opening up called computer programming. There were no classes in it, just taught myself how to do it. And that's the way I earned a living when I got back. So I always had this interest, and then living in Menlo Park was where the homebrew computer club was. I heard about all these hobbyists, and quite frankly, I looked down on them, because I was programming IBM mainframes, and they were playing with little Ataris that added up 1 and 1 and made 2, and they thought that was just so remarkable that a machine could tell them that. And for me, it was, where is this all going? Why are these otherwise intelligent people playing around with toys? And then I heard about Apple, and by that time I had moved into academic life, and I kind of wanted a computer because the Martin Luther King materials were quite voluminous, but I decided, I really need an IBM PC. You know, I don't want to deal with these Apple machines because you pay a lot more for a lot less computing power. That's the way I looked at it. And so in that time, I just kind of thought, this is something that has nothing whatsoever to do with my life. Why are people paying more money to buy these little toys? And I still, in some way, feel that way, you know, even though I have my iPad, my iPhone in my pocket right now, and I kind of figured it out. So I wanted to know more about this guy. And particularly when I found out that he was appropriating the King legacy. Some of you may remember in the mid-1980s, there was this effort to sell more apples by this campaign called Think Different. It was a little bit ungrammatical, and you know, they didn't say think differently. And I later found out that that was purposeful, that he had decided that it was kind of like think big. So rather than think big or think beauty or whatever, he was using it as a noun, think different. And he used as his models Gandhi, King, the Dalai Lama, Picasso, Einstein. And somewhat to my dismay, the campaign worked. and they sold a lot of stuff. And I became familiar with the ad copy for that first commercial. Some of you might have watched it during the Super Bowl. I think it was 1984 or something. And it was the one against IBM. And I went back and looked at the ad copy. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. That was great ad copy. I worked for basically in advertising of, I worked at Columbia Pictures for a while doing this stuff, so I was very familiar with working with J.W. Thompson and those kinds of firms. This was during my undergraduate years. So I kind of understood what marketing is about. Finding your audience, flattering your audience, telling them they can be part of this, just buy these products. Well, what does this have to do with King? I think that among the things that it does is it kind of brings us from King to now, of the way in which the King legacy is used, sometimes misused, sometimes misunderstood. And as we try to take that legacy into the future, it really becomes necessary to say, what does King represent? And using Steve Jobs as a way of getting into King and popular culture, of the way in which we understand King as part of American culture now. And this is, I think, both good and unfortunate. It's good, obviously, because my students come into class, they don't need to be told who Martin Luther King was in the same way they need to be told who Bob Moses is, or Stokely Carmichael is, or Ella Baker, or Diane Nash, and all of these people who were part of my experience, who I think are just as important to know as Martin Luther King. So they come in, they've grown up with the King holiday. It's taught from preschool through the present. And I've helped shape their education about it, because a lot of them, when they come into my class, they've already seen an episode of Eyes on the Prize. They have seen some representation of what the King legacy meant. And that makes teaching both easier and harder. Easier because, as I said, I don't have to explain who this person is. Harder because I have to teach them about who he wasn't. That he wasn't really the mythological figure that they get through popular culture. So, why is that important now? Well, I think that what King has come to symbolize is what this country did that was historic, what the world did that was historic. Part of teaching about King is to get away from the cynicism that nothing important happened in the 1960s, that we're still, and this is from my black students, many of them, we're still oppressed, so nothing has really changed. And from other students that, yes, he was a nice symbol, but he's very much in the past. Doesn't have very much to do with what's going on right now. And then I have to tell them, yeah, something really special happened in the 1960s. Something that was historic, world historic importance. Something as important as the ending of slavery around the world. You think about the revolutions of the modern age. Two of the most important was the struggle to abolish slavery throughout the world. Something that was inconceivable during the 18th century, when to be civilized, one of the definitions, maybe not a self-definition, but one that I would apply, to be a civilized nation, did you own slaves? Did you have slavery there? If you didn't, you're probably a very primitive culture. Every important civilization. Slavery is part of the Bible. Slavery is part of human history. So, as late as the late 19th century, those people who were saying we should abolish it everywhere would have been seen as radical dissenters. No one much would listen to them. 100 years later, it's gone in practically every country. It's at least illegal. It's not part of civilization. In fact, it's almost a definition, you're not quite civilized yet if you're still dealing with slavery. Similarly, in the late 19th century, if someone had said, I think every human being should be a full and equal citizen of the place where they happen to live, that would have been seen as similarly radical, infeasible. Because another definition of civilized society was you have colonies. If you're not, you're just not a very powerful civilized society. And certainly the ones who felt that they were at the top of the food chain in terms of civilization all had colonies. And that was a given. And the notion that there were people outside that category of people with full citizenship would have, that category, first of all, was the majority of humanity. Most people did not have full citizenship rights. Looking at this room, how many of you would have qualified for voting rights in 1890? Probably a fairly small minority of this room. So we're talking about a tremendously important revolution that changed the world in fundamental ways which we're still working out. So that by the mid-1960s, we see this in terms of how to look at the United States, but we're talking about the world. During the 2 decades after World War II, a fundamental shift happens in the world. We go from a place where only a minority have full voting rights, for example. That discrimination on the grounds of various things, race, gender, multiplicity of other things, would have prevented people from participating fully in citizenship. And by the mid-1960s, it's very clear that that revolution, that rights revolution is going to win. That fundamental change happens within less than a century, just like the ending of slavery. Once it starts, it was almost unstoppable. So something did happen. So why are we where we are now? Why, when I turn on the evening news, are we still dealing with oppression related to race? We are still dealing with people who might have formal citizenship rights, but in a practical sense are not at all equal to other citizens. We live in a world that I think that we are just beginning to understand, and I think part of our failure to understand it comes from what I would call the King legacy, the King myth. Because he symbolizes in that popular culture the success. You ask most young people, and a lot of people who probably should know better, what King represents. And they see him the way I first saw him. At the March on Washington, talking about his dream. And if you ask them what that dream was and what happened to it, they would see it as something that was accomplished. That those changes did happen. And that the world did change. So it's interesting when we look at King, we see him at that moment of enormous success in 1963. And we ignore what I will get to, and that is the unfulfilled dream. What he was talking about in 1967 and 1968. So when we look at King, one of the ways in which he's important as a symbol, and for me, it's wonderful because I can take someone who is familiar and say, my 30 years of research has a purpose. I haven't simply confirmed what you already know. I can tell you about a king that you don't know, at least very well, that you need to know better. I can tell you a king who is not the triumphant, heroic leader, but in some ways a failure. And I think that when I was thinking about the structure of this lecture, talking about Steve Jobs, and there is that similarity of a failure who becomes a success. Some of you know the story of Steve Jobs. Walter Isaacson's written this wonderful biography of how he failed, how he was fired from the company that he founded because it was going bankrupt, how he came back and again almost went bankrupt, and ultimately created the most profitable company in the history of the world. So one of the things about that, though, is that there's that parallel of failure. But with King, he never made several $billion. So we don't have the triumphant story for Martin Luther King. Let me just tell you a part of King's life, which I think it happens that one of the things I've done is written a lot about a period of his life when failure was imminent in King's life. And so I'm going to tell you a story about his failure. And it starts in 1962. Now picture this, King has his great success in Montgomery. But if you look at the Montgomery story, Rosa Parks makes him into a leader. She's the one who starts the Montgomery bus boycott. Montgomery women get together, organize the boycott. It's on December 5th, 1955. It's almost 100% successful. And these women then say, but it needs a leader. Now, in today's world, one of them would have said, okay, it needs a leader, here I am. We organized this boycott, it's completely successful. But in 1955, when we're talking about a leader who's going to be the spokesperson for this movement, you needed to get a man, and most likely you needed to get a minister in the South at that point. So they have a meeting on December 5th, 1955. Everybody's there, all the male leaders particularly, and they say, who is going to be the leader of this? And King becomes the accidental leader. I mean, there's lots of stories about why he was chosen. He had no more to do with the boycott than a number of other people who could have also been male leaders and female who could have been selected. One of the reasons was that he had just recently arrived in Montgomery, so he didn't have very many enemies. A lot of the ministers were okay with him, but not this other person I've been competing with for the last, however many years. So they selected this 26-year-old guy, in part because he was articulate. Among Baptist ministers, he actually had a PhD. They knew that he would give a good speech. They didn't know how good. If he had flubbed that first speech that first night, go back and read it. It's an amazing speech because he talks about how he had just 20 minutes to prepare before giving what he called the most important speech of his life. And in that speech, you see the essence of Martin Luther King. Because he doesn't say very much at all about the boycott. He just says, it's wonderful that it happened, and, these wonderful people, and he makes a few references to the women who actually did it. But then he goes on and says, and this is classic Martin Luther King, that this is not getting just a better seat on the bus. This is about the Declaration of Independence. This is about the Constitution of the United States. This is about the Sermon on the Rock. I can imagine people in that audience saying, well, I thought it really was about getting a better seat on the bus. But if you're going to tell us that it's about all these other things, that's going to just build our own sense of the importance of it. And then he gets to the end of the speech and he says, when the history books of the future are written, they will have to say, right there in Montgomery, there lived a great people who had the courage to stand up for their rights. Now, he's talking about a boycott that has gone one day, is not even in the local paper yet, hardly, much less the New York Times or anything else. And he's saying when the history books of the future, they will write about this event. And he was right. If you pick up any U.S. history textbook, no matter how bad, they would have to mention the Montgomery bus boycott. How did he know that? That's another thing about, some of his later speeches, is that his gift was to say that this is about something more. So where was he in 1962 then? He was in an Albany jail. And if some of you know the story, he goes to Albany to help out a movement. He's arrested, which is fine. Promises to stay in jail. But he's up against some pretty resourceful people, segregationists. And they really outfox him. They get him bailed out, comes back, has a trial, goes to jail again. Someone, an anonymous person, comes in, pays his bail. He said, that's the first time I've been thrown out of jail. What are they trying to do? They're trying to just get rid of him. Get out of town. You know, if we can get you out of town, we can win here. Gets arrested a third time. The same thing happens. And by that time, the movement has failed. No changes. If you go back and look at King, August 1962, what the newspapers are writing about him, he's finished. He's failed. He went in there, got hundreds of people arrested. What did he leave them with? Nothing. No concessions. Chief Pritchett, Laurie Pritchett there, goes to the press and says, I'm the one who's nonviolent. I arrested all these people, but I did it nonviolently. I'm the advocate of nonviolence here. Does that sound familiar? So all of these things indicated that if you had looked, if King had been assassinated, which he almost was, by the way, just a month later, he goes to Birmingham to give a speech, and audience like this, there's a young Nazi in the audience who comes up to the stage, attacks him, could just as well have had a gun in his hand, but King just gets beaten up a bit. But he's discouraged as a leader. If his life had ended at that point, we would not be talking about Martin Luther King today. He would have been a minor figure, famous for the Montgomery bus boycott, and that's about it. But then there's another person that comes into his life, Fred Shuttlesworth, a minister in Birmingham. And so this is a story about failure and redemption. Steve Jobs got fired, redemption, he comes back in the 1990s, they ask him to lead the company again, gets a chance for redemption. Martin Luther King comes to Birmingham, but he knows now that the stakes are even higher. If he fails in Birmingham, surely his leadership is finished. He's already having a difficult time reaching young people, because in between Montgomery and Albany, what's happening with the movement? That's when people like Stokely Carmichael, people I knew, we didn't think we were following Martin Luther King. We admired Martin Luther King. But we thought he was following us. We were the ones in the sit-ins, the freedom rides. We were the ones who were in the vanguard of the movement. Martin Luther King was giving good speeches, so we admired that, but he was certainly not in the forefront of the movement. So he goes into Birmingham in the fall of 1962, but he knows not only that the stakes are higher for him, but compared to Albany, Birmingham, that's a serious business. Chief Pritchett in Albany would arrest people nonviolently, at least that's his term. Bull Connor in Birmingham, there was no nicety there. Birmingham, the screenplay I wrote about the Birmingham campaign is called Bombingham. And that was the term used by many people because Birmingham was famous for its use of dynamite. The Klan there were often people, whites who worked in the mining industry. They were very familiar with how to use dynamite. You talk about terrorism. Birmingham was a center for Klan terrorism. If a black family moved even near a white neighborhood, the home would be bombed. If a church gained a reputation like Fred Shuttlesworth's church, it was bombed. And much of it was destroyed in the parsonage. By that time, Shuttlesworth had moved on to another church because he had basically been run out of Birmingham himself. And the church that the Klan thought he was still there, they bomb it, destroy the parsonage of the church. These kinds of activities were going on at all times. So he makes the decision, it's all or nothing. I'm going to go into Birmingham. I'm either going to succeed or my life is going to be a failure, and it's going to be difficult. When they have the last planning meeting, it's pretty well assumed, in fact, they discuss it, of someone's going to die in this campaign. This is not going to be a campaign in which all of us are going to come out of it alive. So he goes there. And the story of Birmingham is a wonderful story. I do recommend that there's a number of wonderful books about it. I'll add to that list as soon as I get mine done. But to make the story short, what happens is that he fails again. He reaches a crucial point in the Birmingham campaign where he runs out of bodies. Will Connor arrests people, and he actually looks at the experience in Albany and said, look, as long as I have more jail cells than they have bodies, I'm going to win. So all the people willing to go to jail, thrown into jail in early April 1963. They get to the point where also the penalty for going to jail, they get an injunction against demonstrations. So now the police don't even have to prove anything. If you are participating in a demonstration, you are de facto violating a court injunction so that you don't even get a trial. You get brought before a judge and you get thrown in jail, and the sentences could be like 60 to 90 days. So very quickly you run out of people willing to spend that long in jail. And that had happened by Good Friday, April 1963. And King has to make this crucial decision. Do I go to jail? And he has this meeting with his advisors, and some of them are saying, look, we need you to go around the country giving speeches, raising money to get all these people out of jail. We need more bail money. You can't go to jail. But he's looking at them and saying, look, I'm the leader. I'm telling all these people that this is what the movement is about. And how would it look if I don't go to jail? So he makes that crucial decision to go to jail, and it's in that jail where he writes his letter from Birmingham jail, because he's criticized for leading this campaign by other ministers, and that sets him off. That made him so angry that he just, out of this passion, while sitting in the jail cell, writes this beautiful letter. But what is often not noted in the accounts of the Birmingham is that when he gets out, he still is a failure. The movement is doomed. He thinks that going into jail, just like in Albany, is going to stimulate people. But instead, they have him in jail. The protests begin to peter out. He has to make another crucial decision. Some of his advisors, people like Dorothy Cotton, other people, younger people, start coming to him and saying, look, we've been having these freedom meetings over at 16th Street Baptist Church. And we've been getting lots of young people coming to these meetings. hundreds of them. They come and they're passionate. And, you know, I have some videos that were taken of that time, and you see these kids just singing at the tops of their lungs. They're kids 13, 14, 15, 16 years old. Most of them high school, but some of them junior high school kids. And they're all passionate. But King faces this decision. Do I allow minors to participate? So the stakes become even larger. Can you imagine being faced with that decision? What's going to happen if one of those minors gets hurt or killed during these demonstrations? And the parents come to me, or the police come to me, contributing to delinquency of minors. What's going to happen? And he has to make this decision. And out of desperation, he says, you know, look, if we don't do this, this campaign is not going to succeed. These kids, they can be in the fight for freedom. They can free themselves. Their parents can't do it. Their parents can't be in jail for 90 days. We have to let them. But even at that point, it was unclear what was going to happen. One of the most remarkable things in the history of this country, I believe, is what was called D-Day. They ended up double D-Day. May 2nd and 3rd, 1963. All of you should see the footage. That's why I wrote the screenplay for that. I think that that's a much better story than Selma, by the way. Because here is probably the crucial event, I would say, in race relations in the 20th century. And who's at the center of it? Young kids. They didn't know what was going to happen. But on May 2nd, which was a school day, first hundreds of kids start leaving school. Some of them don't go to school at all, but the ones who do go to school go by their school and say, come and join us. By the end of the day, several thousand kids are streaming into 16th Street Baptist Church. And basically what happens at that church, a lot of them have had training coming to these rallies, and they kind of know the basics. But essentially what happens at the church is that they come there, they form into groups, they say, downtown is that way. And they leave and they go into the downtown area of Birmingham. At that point, Bill Connor is faced with, what am I going to do? His first response, just like Pritchett in Albany, I'm going to arrest them all. And he does. He arrests hundreds of people. He fills up the city jail. There's this wonderful account I have of a 9-year-old who gets arrested. And we have her testimony. And she talks about being taken down to the jail and then called in for interrogation. You can imagine a 9-year-old sitting there. And they're asking, who put you up to this? And she tells the story about how, I was listening to these people talking about freedom. And I wanted to participate. And what they're obviously trying to do is get some incriminating evidence about an adult contributing to the delinquency of this minor. And what you get from her testimony is this young woman, I just wonder where she is today, I've talked to some of the kids who were part of this and what that meant for her. Because I can imagine the fear as well as that sense of, because she responds to their questions and tells them, tries to be as blunt about it as possible about what happened, why she's there. So what happens is that he very quickly finds out that no matter what he does, and he opens up the fairgrounds so that he can herd this is where they just had I think they were keeping cattle in there, so they cleaned out the cattle, started putting in kids, and that got filled up. And the kids kept coming on the next day. So that by the end of this, it was very obvious that he had no more space. And that's when he began to use the fire hoses and police dogs as a way of trying to intimidate them, scare them out of the downtown area, prevent them from getting into that area in the first place. And that's why those classic pictures of young people being hit by fire hoses, I hope that all of you have seen those images, which became among the most famous images of the entire struggle. And that's what forced the Birmingham business community, whose business was being hurt. No black person was coming in because they were boycotting the downtown area, but no white customers were coming into their stores because you would have to have gotten through a mob scene in order to get to the stores. So they begin to talk about, well, maybe we need to negotiate a settlement. And by that time, the Kennedy administration has become concerned that Birmingham is going to be the first major urban riot of the 1960s. By the end of the second day, there's outbreaks of violence as bystanders see these young kids getting fire hosed, so you can imagine other people getting in, throwing rocks at the police, and this is Birmingham, a major city. So it was quite clear that Birmingham was going to be the first major urban explosion of the 60s. So the Kennedy administration gets involved. They work out a settlement. Make a long story short, it's not the settlement that Fred Shuttlesworth wants. And this has a lot to do with where we are now. He was very concerned that those kids who turned the tide would get some of the benefits, would get some of the jobs, that there would be changes in the schools, that there would be real desegregation. But he is seriously injured during the protests. One of the water hoses hits him. He's knocked down, sent to the hospital. And while he's in the hospital, Martin Luther King, under a lot of federal pressure, agrees to a settlement to suspend the demonstrations. Now, I'm telling you this story, in part because it's a climactic story about what was accomplished. And on the one side, you can see that this is what makes King the person who has a national holiday. Because if he hadn't succeeded in Birmingham, he would not have been invited to give the I Have a Dream speech. You wouldn't have invited someone who had just failed in a major campaign to give. There might not have been a March on Washington in 1963. There would not have been John F. Kennedy getting up in front of the nation and saying this is a moral issue and we need to do something about it, and introducing civil rights legislation that becomes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So we would not have King winning the Nobel Peace Prize the following year and becoming Time Magazine's Man of the Year. So essentially what I'm saying is that if not for 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old kids, Martin Luther King would not be the subject of my talk today. That was his redemption. That's what turned failure into success. But the question I'd leave you with is, how did he feel? I can tell you that I knew Fred Shuttlesworth, and he told me in some detail some of the discussions that King had when he finds out he's sitting in his hospital, not in his hospital bed, but he's sitting in bed, turns on the television, and John F. Kennedy is announcing, we have reached a settlement in Birmingham, and the demonstrations are suspended. Shuttlesworth gets out of his bed, rushes over to the place where King is staying, finds him with these federal officials, and uses some very unministerial language. One of the things that I guess I can repeat in this room said, you had no authority to do that. We invited you here. And if I tell my followers what you just did, you are going to be Martin Luther King shit. And he was enraged that this happened. And the reason why he was enraged is he said, those kids who just went to jail, your settlement sold them out. You got concessions that will not open up any jobs for them, will not bring about better education for them. It is a concession that is designed to soothe the black middle class in Birmingham, who are going to be the beneficiaries. And they weren't in the demonstrations. By the way, one of the members of that middle class, Condoleezza Rice. And her parents would not let her participate in these demonstrations. So what he's basically saying is that this is going to benefit the Condoleezza Rices of the world. And they're going to have, because they're the beneficiaries, they're the ones who are going to win, even though they did not sacrifice. So when we look back at the Birmingham campaign, what we see is that it's a very complex story that tells us a lot about what was achieved. Civil Rights Act of 1964, no small achievement. Ultimately leading to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We are no longer, it marked the end of the Jim Crow system in the sense that by 1965, that system of oppression had really been overcome. And I ask you in your own mind, was King right to make the settlement? I could easily imagine him saying, you'll never get another chance like this to achieve a settlement that is going to have such long-range effects. But on a personal level, he also needed it. He needed it for Martin Luther King. He needed to have a success. So, when we look at where we are now, I think that Martin Luther King, after that, when you look at his Nobel Prize lecture and all the speeches he gives later, he always makes clear that, yes, we're getting civil rights reform, but that's not what I'm fighting for. When he gives his speech, he says that what is really at work here is not just a battle for racial equality. And certainly not a battle for civil rights reform. It's much deeper than that. It has to do with poverty. It has to do with actually bringing about change. He begins to develop what he calls his Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged. And it has to do with global issues that can't be resolved just in the United States. It has to do with war. It has to do with understanding that violence is one of the reflections of the inequalities in the world, and that we're going to continue to experience that. So I'd like to end, as I often do. One of the advantages of editing Martin Luther King is I can always find an apt quote. And this one I'd like to just let you think about where he was in 1967 when he gives a sermon. And this sermon is called Unfulfilled Dreams. And let me just read it, because I think it's pretty well self-explanatory. He's talking at the end of his life, and I'll leave this with you. One of the great agonies of life is that we are constantly trying to finish that which is unfinishable. We are commanded to do that. And so, like David, find ourselves in many instances having to face the fact that our dreams are not fulfilled. This is the story of life. So many of our forebears used to sing about freedom, and they dreamed of the day when they would get out of the bosom of slavery, the long night of injustice. And they used to sing little songs, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen, nobody knows but Jesus." They thought about a better day as they dreamed their dream. And they would say, "I'm so glad trouble doesn't last always. By and by, I'm going to lay down my heavy load." But so many died without having the dream fulfilled. And each of you in some way is building some kind of temple. The struggle is always there. It gets discouraging sometimes. It gets very disenchanting sometimes. Some of us are trying to build a temple of peace. We speak out against war, we protest, but it seems your head is going against a concrete wall. It seems to mean nothing. And so often you set out to build a temple of peace, you are left lonesome. You are left discouraged. You are left bewildered. Well, that is the story of life. But the thing that makes me happy is that I can hear a voice crying through the vista of time saying, "It may not come today, or it may not come tomorrow. It is well that is within thine heart." He goes on to say that whenever you try to build a temple, there's a tension at the heart of the universe between good and evil. Wherever there is a struggle between those two forces, the external forces, and it's structured in our own lives also. Psychologists have tried to grapple with it in their way, and they say various things. Sigmund Freud used to say that this tension is between what we call the id and the superego. Some of us feel it's a tension between God and man. And in every one of us, there's a war going on. It's a civil war. I don't care who you are. I don't care where you live. There's a civil war going on in your life. And every time you set out to be good, there's something pulling on you, telling you to be evil. It's going on in your life. Every time you set out to love, something keeps pulling you, trying to get you to hate. Every time you set out to be kind and say nice things, something is pulling on you to be just jealous and envious. There's a Jekyll and Hyde going on in us. We end up saying, with the Latin poet Ovid, I see and approve the good things. I see and approve the good things, but the bad things I do. But the evil things I do. We end up having to agree with Plato that human personality is like a charioteer with two headstrong horses wanting to go in different directions. Sometimes, like St. Augustine, we say, Lord, make me pure, but not yet. In the final analysis, God does not judge us, though, by the separate incidents or separate mistakes we make, but by the total bent of our lives. In the final analysis, God knows that his children are weak and they are frail, and in the final analysis, what requires is that your heart is right. And the question I want to raise with you, is your heart right? If your heart isn't right, fix it up. Get God to say about you, he may not have reached the highest height. He may not have realized all of his dreams, but he tried. I don't know about you, he said, but I can make a testimony. You don't need to go out saying that Martin Luther King is a saint. Oh no, I want you to know this morning that I am a sinner, like all of God's children. But I want to be a good man, and I want to hear a voice saying to me one day, I take you in, and I bless you because you tried. It is well, it was within mine heart. Thank you. Now I get to my favorite part where I can respond to your questions, and I'll try to do it as briefly as possible so we can get as many as possible. So please, just whatever you want to ask about, my talk or anything else that I'm involved in. And I understand that a lot of students have to get to class, so. First question, who wants to be? Yes. You want to stand up?
I got the microphone. Right.
Oh, wait a minute. I think there's a mic.
Okay. So I just want to know your opinion. Do you think that Martin Luther King should have taken that first victory, or should he have held out?
You know, in writing about the Birmingham campaign, I want to leave that as something where I have my own opinion on that, but it's a complex opinion because I wasn't there. You know, it's hard to put yourself in that situation of knowing what is at stake and saying what I would have done with all the pressures on me. I think it's unrealistic for those of us to go back, and this is true in history in general. It's hard to make retrospective judgments. All I can say is that there were consequences on either side of the decision. We will never know what would have happened if he had said, no, I want to get more. I want you to win all of the things that you were fighting for in this campaign. And maybe he would have failed. Maybe they would not have made those concessions. And he would have gone out of Birmingham as a failure. Would history be better? Would we have been better without the Martin Luther King who gave the I Have a Dream speech, who won the Nobel Peace Prize? And who's to say that we would have been better if the concessions had not been made and Birmingham became the Watts of 1963? That is, you know, the first of the major urban riots of the 60s. Would this country have been a better place? Would those kids have been better served to risk a smaller victory to try to get a larger victory? Isn't that what always happens in any kind of protest campaign? You know, what's going to happen with Black Lives Matter? At some point, someone's going to say, here's the concession, which I think might get people off the streets. Now, is there going to be body cameras and all these sorts of things? When you know that the way movements work is that the people who are most seriously involved, they're already saying, you know, we understand that this is simply a symptom of a larger issue of the criminal justice system. It's not, so simply getting police not to shoot unarmed people is nice. It saves some unarmed people, but it's not going to solve the basic problem. So are we willing to have that discussion in the United States? You know, that really brings it to now. You know, we're always faced with, do you take half a loaf and come back for more? You know, and when you're talking about Martin Luther King, it's certainly, he never suggested that what I got in Birmingham was what I wanted. You can look at the rest of his life. What is he doing the last day of his life? He's in Memphis helping a sanitation workers strike. And that is where he gave his life. He's in a poor people's campaign. Think of that. What, again, kind of demystify the poor people's campaign. What was it? Think of the Occupy movement. Remember a few years back when people were sitting down, maybe it happened here in Providence, I don't know whether people went to public places like parks and occupied, you know, City Hall, occupied a space and said, you know, we're going to stay here until somebody does something about this problem of economic inequality in the society. Martin Luther King's Occupy movement was the National Mall. That's what he was proposing, going and sitting in that area from the Capitol to the Lincoln Memorial, occupying it until Congress did something about the issue of poverty. So you can't argue that King wasn't engaged with the issues that were left behind in Birmingham. That's what he died for. And I think some of the reason why he was willing to die is that he didn't win those issues in Birmingham. So, you know, that's why I think we need a film about the Birmingham campaign, a really honest film that I think would get right to the heart of where we are today. Maybe on this side so we can, yes, in the back.
Hi, I have two questions. So first one is, how much progress do you think we've made since MLK's death as we find ourselves in similar situations in terms of race relations with police, et cetera? And how much work do you think we have to go? And also, what's your stance on Colin Kaepernick and him protesting the national anthem? How do you feel about that?
Okay, I'll deal with the really big question first and then get to the less. Where are we? Well, I think my previous answer kind of gets at that. That I think that winning on the issue of equal civil rights, equals what some people call equal citizenship, that victory was fundamentally important. It was something that you know, we should be thankful for, every person in this room, because what happened with that is that it opened the door for women's rights. You know, some of you might be familiar with the fact that the original Civil Rights Act did not mention gender discrimination, but that clause was put in primarily because there were a couple of women in Congress who were able to get a conservative Southerner who was against the passage of the law, and he thought that by giving in on this issue, he would defeat the entire law because it would make it so ridiculous no one would vote for gender equality. So it changed that. It opened the door for all kinds of everything up to gay marriage and I mean, once you establish the principle that someone cannot be denied their equal citizenship rights for reasons of bigotry, that prejudice is not a justification for creating a different class of citizenship. Once you establish that principle, then every successive movement will just say, look, that just applies to us too. So now you have transgender kids who maybe recognize, some of them, the ones who are conscious, do recognize, but that they are the beneficiaries of the Civil Rights Act. But what King would point out is that that act was an act of compromise. It didn't go to the heart of the issue of equality. If you wanted to go to the heart of the issue of equality, you would have said, every citizen deserves equal opportunity in every area of life affected by government. So you can't have this phenomenon of, which, because of the way the law was written, what it encouraged was, if you want equal education, you leave the black school and go to the white school, because they can't stop you anymore. So it opened the door for, just think of I don't know. I don't know what situations are here, but I would imagine it's not that different, that if you have the ability to get out of the black school, you do. And so integration becomes leaving behind somebody. What justice and equal education would involve is what happens to those left behind? What happens to them? What is society's obligation to make that predominantly black school equal to the predominantly white school, even if it means spending more on the education of black kids, because, in part, because of the legacy of the past. So that's where we didn't do it. And another thing, and this is something that I think is really fundamental, is that part of the revolution about equal citizenship was a human rights revolution. Even that term didn't get really used until after World War II, when people began to think about this issue of what is the underlying principle there. And the underlying principle is that every human being deserves rights. Every human being. But one of the things that citizenship did is it made us very complacent about the larger issue. So that right now, if you ask, what is your human right? Probably if you think about it, most of you would have a blank. What rights do you have that you can take anywhere in the world? What rights does anyone have that they can take anywhere in the world? So when we're talking about human rights, we're talking about an ideal that, if anything, we've moved further away from rather than closer to. Because getting citizenship rights, if you happen to live in a powerful country in the world, it means that no matter where you go in the world, you've got human rights. It's called your passport. If you go into those countries, those 50 countries that gained their independence after World War II, and you go into many of them. I was in Zambia for the celebration of their 50th anniversary of independence. And I saw the irony of they're celebrating getting independence. And you go over to the American embassy and you see a long line. What is that long line? That long line are people who will, in an instance, give up that citizenship right for a work visa in the United States or Europe. So what's happening in the United States? Why is immigration such a big issue? It's because you have this gulf between the rich countries and the poor countries. Citizenship rights mean something if you're in a rich country. It means very little if you're in a poor country. Because one of the basic human rights, go back and look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one of the basic human rights that has been exercised throughout history is the right to move in search of opportunity. How did Americans get to be Americans? Now, you talk about a wall. Native Americans should have set up a wall at Plymouth Rock. If they had, they wouldn't have faced competition from these people who wanted to come over without a visa. The vast majority of Americans came in without a visa. By the way, the vast majority of Mexican Americans came in without a visa. They didn't so much move in the Southwest, the border moved. So let's get real about these issues. You know, if we're real about human rights, we have to confront that. And for most middle-class Americans, there's an anxiety about that. There's reasons for that anxiety. You know, what would happen if everybody could move here? Well, you know, if someone had thought that in the late 19th century, probably half of the American population wouldn't be here. All the people who are now voting for the wall. So I think that complacency about human rights because of success of citizenship rights is at the heart of a lot of issues. And it's one of the issues that young people are going to have to grapple with in the 21st century. That you're going to have to face that issue of, you know, I don't believe we will have human rights in the world as long as there are borders. Now that's a radical thing to say, right? But how can you justify the way the world is now? I can go, and I have. I've worked outside the United States. I've taught in France, no problem. I live in Silicon Valley. Half the people there are from other countries, including not Steve Jobs, but his birth father. You know, when we talk about Silicon Valley, you're basically talking a lot, probably half the executives are from other countries. So what we have is really a class-based human rights system. If you are skilled, middle-class engineer, you have human rights. And especially if you start out with a European or American passport. And the world is yours. But that's the issue for your generation. And it's going to be a tough one. It's going to be one where you know, one of the I hate to go on about this, but one of the generalizations I would make about the period since the 1960s is the phenomenon of not in my backyard. Now, we apply that a lot to urban issues. You know, we don't want housing for the poor in our neighborhood. We don't want these bad things to happen as long as it's not in our neighborhood. Well, every place on earth is somebody's neighborhood. And you apply that to a country, and basically what you're saying is that as long as we can keep these problems at bay outside our country, we'll be okay. And that's going to be a challenge for this century. Maybe on this side, is there? I think that another more positive way of putting that, I think, is that young people really need to start getting out of the language of civil rights. It is important to defend civil rights gains, to make sure that we don't go back. But I would hope that as your consciousness begins to get raised about these issues, that you begin to speak, at least understand things in human rights terms. You might find that you'll be like those people who started talking about universal citizenship rights when no one thought that that was possible. And I think that's the way we look at human rights today. If you think of universal human rights, even your liberal friends will look at you and say, you mean a world without borders? A world in which health care is available to everyone? A world in which educational opportunity is free? And people look, what planet are you on? What have you been smoking? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I first of all was happy to see at least some of my students followed my advertisement to come to class today, or come to the talk today. And when I advertised it, I told them, given this title, that they should come as a chance to think critically for themselves about why they're at a liberal arts college and what the value of that education is. And so in that spirit, I want to ask a question that's kind of dangerous for me and the other people whose paychecks depend on students and parents paying a lot of money to come to liberal arts colleges. Early on in the speech, you talked about Steve Jobs, and you talked about that Think Different campaign and the way in which Steve Jobs, whose paycheck depended on getting people to buy Apple products, made a very clever usage and appropriation of the legacy of people like King and like Gandhi. So I wonder if you can either cause our students to worry or set them at ease by saying, what do you think is different about what Steve Jobs did in using this legacy to advertise what they do, and what we've done in inviting you here under a talk under this title, using Dr. King to advertise what we do?
That's a good way of wrapping up these themes, I think. And because as you know, if you've been listening to my talk, and I hope most of you have, I haven't noticed anyone asleep yet. Well, at Stanford, there's this division called techie fuzzies. Guess who's the fuzzy? The people who are not techies. So if you are in liberal arts, you're a fuzzy. And I come to things with a somewhat unique perspective as a techie fuzzy, because that's my background. And surprisingly, that's another thing I have in common with Steve Jobs. Some of you probably have, he gave a commencement address at Stanford, which is the most downloaded commencement address in the history of commencement addresses. I invite you sometime to listen to it, but basically, to summarize his point, is that he talks about his time at Reed. It wasn't long. He dropped out after his first year, and then he writes how that freed him to go to the classes that he wanted to, as opposed to the classes that were required for him to go. He just slept in other kids' bedrooms and just continued to go there. He didn't want to spend his parents' money because it's a very expensive place to go. So he talks in this commencement address about taking a course in calligraphy and how that shaped his understanding of Apple computers, because it was the first to start using fonts. Because some of you, back in the days when I used to program computers, it was, well, what's the font, the generalized font that they use? But it was a very ugly one. Courier? Yes, Courier. And everything was that, because it seemed like, it was IBM, that was computers. So he talked about the way in which the humanities influenced him, and he makes the argument that he would not have succeeded in business if he had simply set out to make more money. But because he wanted to make beautiful technology, simple technology, expensive technology, but very simple and very beautiful. I mean, his products are technology at its best. Because they are not only aesthetically good, but technologically good. And so one of the things I think about technology is that that's really what social movements are about, is who uses tools for what purpose. And the battles over that. Because tools, if you think of them in human history, are meant to make people more powerful, more able to do things, more able to free them. You know, if we didn't have technology, we would still be out there with digging almost by our hands to plant something, rather than using a tractor, rather than using technology to make the world more productive. But so there's always been this notion of technology as liberation, and then the question of who controls the technology and for what purpose. So when I think of the revolution that I was in the center of, you know, that I came to Stanford in 1974. And as I said, I knew people who were part of this revolution, the greatest communication revolution the world has ever seen. I mean, the notion, when I started the King Project, if someone had come to me and said, now guess what? By the early 21st century, these documents that you're working with could be available instantaneously to anyone, anywhere in the world. I was about to pull out the King papers are here. I can pull up them all. Images of them, as well as, you know, and actually it's not so much here as in the cloud, and I can read it, which is even more remarkable. So, but is disseminating Martin Luther King the main purpose of this? Whose interests are being served? Is it widening the gulf between rich and poor, or is it closing the gulf? I think it could be either. I think that's the political question. That's the question of, and unfortunately, I think we have this sense among many people who are in favor of social justice, in favor of change, of kind of the technophobic response. If we just went back to a simplistic life. When the vast majority of poor people in the world are voting with their feet, I've had that simplistic life. I've had that in rural Mexico, or, you know, the poor places in the world. There are people who don't have to deal with iPhones. They can't afford them. So that becomes the question of, do you create a movement that says that technology, when I mentioned Steve Jobs and Apple creating the richest company in the world, you know why? Because of our copyright law. Because look at the Constitution. What does it say about copyright? How long should it last? Does anyone know what the Constitution says? For a short period. people will have the right to protect their intellectual property for a short period. You know what that short period is now? It's essentially forever, because we're talking about patents and the way in which the law is used. Yes, 16 years, but after 16 years, you've developed other related patents, and it just goes on and on because of the corporate structure. Why do we have corporations? Corporations are part of our legal structure and have been for the last, I think, 200 years now. But they don't have to be. They can be regulated. So those are all political questions about what should we do. What would it have meant, for example, if Apple had not been able to protect its intellectual property, and China, instead of making iPhones where most of the profits goes to Silicon Valley, said, we'll do what the United States did in the 19th century, which the United States was the major country violating intellectual property. If China did that today, of course, there would be a world war over that. If China were producing iPhones that cost $50, and, what would happen? So all of these are questions. Again, young people in this audience, I hope that at least these force you to think about your future. I won't be here very long. And this century is yours. And it's going to be a difficult and perplexing time. And part of it is understanding where you are. So I'll just end with one thing about liberal education. And I think King gave this wonderful sermon called 3 Dimensions of a Complete Life. And I thought that with some variations, he's talking about religion, and because he says that there's 3 dimensions. One of them is the one of essentially where you are in the world. And his 3 dimensions were the breadth of life, the length of life, the height of life. Okay, and the length of life, obviously, the breadth of life. What is your relationship with other people? The height of life, the spiritual dimension. But if you think about that tripartite way, it really describes a liberal education. I think if any of you can intelligently say where you are in the world, what is your relationship to everything else going on the globe? Try not to invade countries that you can't find on a map, things like that. Where you are historically, where do you fit between the past and the future? Because that's where we are. We are the past of some future. We are the future of some past. And if we understand ourselves in that way, that's a fundamental way of understanding. And where are you with respect to the great ideas about ideals, morals, values, questions of equality, justice, the things that have been discussed back to the biblical prophets almost 3,000 years ago, when we talk about the people who, Amos and Isaiah, Micah, all these prophets who were, what were they concerned about? What is God's will? Do justice to other people. King would always use Isaiah of how do you create a life, and he wanted to do this, of bringing justice to those around you. The Good Samaritan story was the story he told again and again and again, which raises the fundamental question, what is our obligation to the stranger? What obligation do we owe to someone because you can imagine history being divided into the time when people were mainly concerned about their own family, the people that their own tribe maybe that got that far, but no further than that. And maybe now we're at a stage where we might possibly be concerned about other Americans, hopefully, not just white Americans or black Americans. But when does that get to the point of being concerned about the fate of every single person, every stranger out there? You know, what is Isaiah and Jesus' injunction to us about the stranger? I think most of you know. Treat the stranger as thyself and as a child of God. And how many of us do that? So it's an injunction that I think is really says something about where we are, where we need to go. And you know, to me, that's the essence of a liberal arts education. If you can get all those things into it and get somebody to be relatively intelligent about that by the end of their 4 years here, you've succeeded tremendously. On that, I'll end.
Thank you, Professor Carlson. But before we do and leave, I want to tell everyone that there's a reception right out those doors, and I invite everyone to please come and join us in developing those 3 dimensions of the liberal arts education. Again, one more time, join me in thanking Professor Carson.